Oopsie, right, okay. Thank you and welcome to Middlesex University Childhood and Society SIG Group. We've got the difficult dialogue strand today, and we have Dr. Nathan Fretwell, one of our own from Middlesex University, who is going to share his research, which is focusing on learning, sharing and caring, pedagogical features of parent educational activism. So please do engage with the chat if you've got any reflections, any comments or any questions you'd like to share and open up a dialogue with later on after Nathan's finished his presentation. And any reflections at all, please, we can look forward to seeing each other sharing our thinking on the chat. Right, Nathan, so it's over to you and thank you very much. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Angela. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about a project that started off quite some time ago. I think originally 2018 started collecting data, and John was involved in the start of the project when it got going. But it's become a much bigger thing and has carried on and is continuing into the future. I'm going to try and draw a line on it, but I keep getting contacted by groups who are running versions of campaigns and so on. But this paper is going to focus on the first tranche of data that we collected between 2018 and 2020, partly because the rest of it's not been analysed yet anyway. This is the kind of third in the series of papers I've produced around the project. The first one that John and I brought out, so the first one that's actually seen the light of day so far, focused really on parents' treatments at the hands of authorities and how they negotiated that and their feelings of disenfranchisement, disaffection, and all of these kind of things. The second one, which is in some interminable review process with an unnamed journal, but it's racked up 7 months now, I think. I've not even had it back. But that was about, again, focusing on the emotions of parents' activism, but specifically about how it was framed in terms of care and their relationships to their children in relation to this. Again, very emotive kind of material that I was engaging with. And in some ways, the one I'm dealing today was much harder for me to write because the other ones were a bit like blood and thunder. You know, I'm working with the passions of parents, and that kind of the kind of emotive impetus to their own discourse. I don't know, it just made it easier to write in some ways. Whereas I'm taking a little bit of a step back and looking at some different elements of their activism, their engagement, their campaigning in this one. I also, as of last week, I think it was, had a BERA blog published, which engages with some of these kind of issues. And in that, I was responding to Amanda Spielman's outgoing Ofsted report, where she basically lambasted parents for breaking the social contract between home and schools and so on. And in that blog, I kind of show, look, you know, there's sometimes parental resistance and opposition can actually be just. Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater here, kind of thing. There's a podcast that I produced on these kind of issues as well. But like I say, this one, it's not entirely denuded, I don't think, of passion in parents' accounts. But this one, I've taken a little bit of a step back to think about what kind of learning processes are involved in parents' activism. And in this, I'm speaking to a whole body of literature around activist pedagogies. So within social movement literature, within radical political literature, and so on. And so I'm looking at this a little bit differently, thinking about what kind of learning and teaching processes are involved in the activism. And I focus on three particular areas. What parents learn in and through engaging in activism, then taking a more of a collective dimension to it and thinking about how knowledge is shared and how expertise and experience are shared, particularly both within campaign groups themselves, but particularly between parents involved across different kinds of campaigns, okay, within education. And then lastly, and this is, I think, the key kind of nub of the paper and the kind of key argument of the paper as well, I home in on how parents frame and understand their activism as a vehicle for passing on important political lessons to their children. And I think that is a really important point, and partly because through attending to that and through thinking about that, we really get a sense for the peculiarity and you know, the distinctiveness of parental activism as parental activism, not as, you know, any other kind of activism, but the kind of activism that parents engage in. And the written version of this should be coming out in a special issue that myself and Lee Jerome, our colleague, are publishing on educational activism for the journal Education, Citizenship and Social Justice. Hopefully that should see the light of day, perhaps toward later part of this year or so on, but the paper's been written, submitted, edited and all of those kind of things. And just to plug the special issue, there's loads of other interesting papers in there, including one based on comic-based research, which is a very novel way of looking at things, I think. So just a bit of context to start off then. So, like I said before, I've been looking at parental activism in education for pushing 6 years now. And I think over the last, and this was part of the reason why I prompted the research originally, I think over the last 10, 15 years, we've seen many more parent campaigns emerging around education. And I think that's probably due to a couple of things. One, the internet and social media and how much easier it is to mobilize people. And then second, the impact of austerity. We've basically had 15, you know, at least 15 years of austerity policies and fiscal, you know, straightening of public resources and all of those kind of things. And I think the part of the impact of that has been, we've now seen around education, because of the lack of funding, the lack of resources, many more campaigns emerging. I think one of the real hotbeds around this at the minute is around SEND provision and SEND issues, because the funding for SEND has been completely stripped away. And so we're getting lots of campaigners around SEND issues emerging, but also other things, discipline, uniform, closures of settings. And I've actually conducted research with lots of campaign groups, particularly in this latter part, that engage with the vast majority of these. The only thing that I've not really worked on is, partly, I suppose, because of my own political leanings and social values and all of those kind of things, but there are campaigns that keep happening around relationship and sex education in schools and the introduction of, like, the No Outsiders program or whatever it might be. And that is obviously quite big in America at the minute as well. So I would suggest that, you know, there are forms of left-wing parental activism and forms of right-wing parental activism. But I think some of the kind of general points I make across these different papers, I think will probably likely apply to parental activism as a phenomenon in and of itself, I think.
Based on
so, you know, there's been these increases. There we go. There's been these increases in parental activism, at least anecdotally, but this is a field, an area of research that is massively underdocumented in British scholarship in particular. The only other empirical studies that I've come across was Carol Vincent, way back in 2000, wrote a book about basically campaign organizations, parent-led campaign organizations, which is very good and very interesting, but it's obviously really dated now. And then Howard Stevenson's work on anti-academization struggles from 2016. There is another one, Sibley White, can't remember her first name, who does a critical discourse analysis of more than a score campaign materials, but it's not based on empirical research as such. In America, there's a much more of a developed field. It's still quite small, but there's a much more of a developed field. But certainly within the English context or the British context, there is very, very little existing research in the field. In terms of thinking around what constitutes parental activism, this is my kind of definition of it. Pablo Jasis, American scholar, he's got a good working definition, but I'm partly interested in what specifies or makes distinctive parental activism from other kinds of activism. And I don't necessarily mean just in educational context, but how we can, understand it and define the phenomenon. So I describe it here as political action undertaken by parents aimed specifically, and that's the key here, specifically promoting, protecting, or preserving their own or other children's interests. The second paper on effective practices of care deals with that other children's interests as well. But I think this is the important point here is that it is care, this idea of parental care and parental responsibility, which constitutes the very specificity of parental activism as such. It is that which defines it, it's that which motivates it, it's that which impels it, and it's that which defines it, I think. And some of the points I'm going to make later on about how parents viewed their activism as a means for educating their children, giving them some kind of civic democratic education, needs to be borne in mind in the context of the importance of care around parental activism. The second kind of contextualizing aspect is around activist pedagogies. There is a body of literature around this, and I don't think all activism in a way is pedagogical, okay, in the sense of a social pedagogy, because at the very least, one of the things that, unless you're engaging in direct action, I suppose, where you are directly trying to intervene and stop something, all forms of protest have a pedagogical element, because you're trying to convince, whether it's policymakers, leaders, politicians, whoever it is, the general public, that this cause is important, is right, we need to do something about it. So all forms of activism and campaigning really carry that kind of pedagogical element, I think. And these are some of the sources where it's discussed in quite some detail. Lovely book just published by Mario Novelli and colleagues, where they talk about social movements being laboratories of learning. Because not only do activists learn their own things, but they conduct research, they produce new knowledge. So there's a thoroughly pedagogical element to social movements, activist organizations. But as Heaton points out, there are also important sites, not just for generating knowledge and learning relevant to campaign issues and goals, but for learning and practicing forms of democracy as well, for encouraging democratic dispositions and so on and so forth. And both of these elements, as you'll see when I discuss the data, run through parents' activism as well. But going back to Foley's way, from the turn of the century, the end of 1999, much of these kind of pedagogical elements actually don't get attended to enough, partly because we've got dramatic social movements and activism on one side with very clear social goals, but we don't really pay attention as much to the kind of learning processes and practices that happen within activist organizations. And his argument is basically, look, if we want to accord it the value it deserves, particularly, and this is his interest, as a form of adult learning, then we need to make it visible. So partly, this is what the paper's doing, is contributing to what Tracy Ellis has framed as a pedagogical term within social movement studies. So the study itself then, I've mentioned before, I'm dealing with the first tranche of data here. So this is 2018 to 2020. And that involved predominantly semi-structured interviews, some of them paired. So one of the campaigns, I interviewed both of the key campaigners in the middle of the campaign and then at the end of the campaign, and I interviewed them together. Semi-structured interviews, 19 of them individual. Ran a couple of focus groups with the campaigns with different participants, and then observations of some events, which is where all these pictures are coming from. Non-participant observation, I would say. So this paper focuses on 3 campaigns in particular then. Protect Children's Education is the first one, and this is the one where all the images are taken from one of their campaign events. So this was predominantly a campaign around school funding, so contesting and challenging funding cuts within education. It originally started in a large city on the south coast of England, and this is the group that we collected data from. They were kind of the core group of from this original campaign, but then it spread out, and they basically had campaigns in all different regions of the country that had the same branding and the shared ideas. So this big event that you can see in the images, that was where everybody got together. But we focused on the original founding group, if you will. And as part of that, we spoke to 6 mothers and 1 father. The second campaign, Eastborough Anti-Academisation Coalition, does what it says on the tin. It's an anti-academisation campaign. Yeah? It was based in a large London borough, the large London borough, outer London borough. And it was actually a coalition within the borough of different school campaigns that were all contesting academisation at the same time. And this was a case of voluntary academisation as well, voluntary conversion. Basically, the local authority had decided that they wanted to pursue academisation for the schools within their jurisdiction. And it was predominantly primary, well, it was all primary schools that we actually collected data from, but it was a few of them involved in the campaign, I think, were secondary school based as well. So we had 5 fathers, 2 mothers, a retired teacher and union activist. So one of the kind of campaign coordinators, in a way, was not somebody who had children directly of school age, but she was a key impetus within the campaign themselves. This was a really powerful and important campaign. They ended up taking the local authority to the High Court and got a, I always try and forget that. I always try and forget what the term is, but like some kind of legal injunction preventing to forestall any further academisation. They actually got a motion passed within the council as well, of a commitment for the council not to continue pursuing academisation within the borough. The last one, Crowley Parents Campaign, another very high profile anti-academisation campaign at the time. It was in one of the home counties bordering London. And 2 mothers really drove that campaign. As I mentioned, I spoke to them at the middle and at the end of the campaign. And both of these anti-academisation campaigns were very high profile, but they're also, the parents there were involved in very bitter, acrimonious struggles with the educational authorities who were pushing through. Crowley was a case of forced academisation, but it was one of these where you see it often where basically they get a negative Ofsted judgment, and that's used to ramrod through the academisation process, where the parents and the teachers and the head teacher are like, well, this is not our school, this Ofsted report doesn't reflect our school, and so on. So again, very powerful campaign. One of the, I think, kind of ethical troubles for me as the researcher here is one of the reasons I wanted to do a study like this was to help document ordinary, as I say, ordinary in scare quotes, but ordinary parents' efforts to challenge what they saw as deep-seated injustices about the whole processes they're engaged with. And I wanted to be able to record these kind of struggles. And that meant, you know, the campaigns and, you know, they're there in the record. But it became quite clear, certainly by the time I was speaking with the Crowley parents, the idea of using real campaign names would be untenable, because it, particularly if you think about Crowley, where it's two mothers in principle who are driving it, it becomes much more obvious to be able to identify who parents are if you start naming the campaigns. So I had to make the very difficult decision to anonymise the campaign groups as well. So all proper names, really, areas, participants, campaign groups. Pseudonyms are used throughout in order to protect participants' identity. Very interestingly, parents themselves were less bothered about even being named themselves, all right? But I thought it was important, particularly for Crowley, which went right up to the very top of the DFE. And there's lots of really powerful and problematic data about how they are treated by key educational authorities. If you want an insight into that, the book chapter that I published last year deals with that in some detail. Okay. So let's move on to actually thinking about these kind of learning processes that are involved within activism then. So the first kind of, this is the learning of the learning, sharing and caring bit of the title, yeah? Well, the first is about what parents learn in and through engaging in activism, okay? And this, yeah, I think you can further subdivide this into three kind of, or distill it into three kind of areas. The first is the kind of knowledge and skills that the parents acquire in and through engaging in activism, okay? And Tracey Ellis writes about, she calls activists who are new to activism, for whom some sudden change in their life circumstances, i.e. say, you know, your school's suddenly going to be academized or whatever, she calls these circumstantial activists, as opposed to lifelong activists who have spent many, many years fighting different campaigns in different kind of areas. And I think all of the parents or the vast majority, vast majority, were circumstantial activists in this case. They had no prior experience of engaging in activism. A few did, but the vast majority didn't. And so they are new to this. And being new to this, you're thrust into this situation where you need to learn, and you need to learn rapidly. Particularly if you're being told your school's going to academize by this date. Well, what is academization? We need more information. Oh my God, this doesn't seem right. We need to get a campaign together. How do you run a campaign? You know, they're thrust into this very immediate, particularly the anti-academization campaigns, thrust into a situation with a sense of urgency. And that's matched with the urgency with which they need to learn. And we see it here, like Molly and Mina, the two CPC parents. We needed to learn quickly, on our toes. Isra, one of the Eastborough campaigners, we were all pushing our comfort zone. And this is important as well. This is not stuff that parents knew in advance. This is kind of, you know, they're like, oh my goodness, what's going on? And they have to learn all of these things. They have to step outside of the kind of things that they are familiar with and start learning new things. Such things as public speaking. So you've got parents who have had very limited engagement with the kind of, you know, things like council meetings and all of those kind of things. Suddenly they're having to stand up and lead these kind of things and organize people. And so there's that element of learning new skills as well. How to collaborate and network with people, how to promote campaigns, but also how to undertake research. I remember one of our participants, Aminul, he said something like, I knew nothing about academies. It meant nothing to me. And I've had to learn all of this kind of stuff to be able to make sense of it first before they went to the consultation, and then actually to fight the campaign on that basis. So parents are thrust into this and they have to learn loads of new skills, build up new knowledge and so on. but in some cases as well, they're able to utilize existing skills that they've already got. So the PCE campaign, the funding campaign, for example, the parent body in this campaign was largely what you might describe as middle class, largely white. Parents were from a variety of different professional backgrounds, design, media, these kind of things. And so they were able to pool all of them resources and put them into new use. But even if these skills and knowledge exist, you are putting them into new use. You're using them in a different way. You're stretching your experience and so on. But it did produce, several different kind of campaigns within the broader movement. They were very eye-catching, very media savvy, got lots of attention, lighting up, sending projections onto big public buildings or running media campaigns that could be sent through Twitter. I mean, it was astonishing. And even the kind of leaflets that they produced were like, proper professional quality kind of leaflets. But they're using them in a new way, putting them to use, in novel and interesting ways. So learning what your skills can do in a new kind of arena. And just to deepen some of these kind of things. But yeah, so parents conducted their own research. As Carol points out here, she didn't know a great deal about school funding before, but as part of the running of the campaign and being involved in the campaign, she's engaged in research and learning and understands how the school system and funding work to a much greater degree. The Crowley Parents Campaign, Molly had a prior experience in corporate compliance, so she knew to do things like check Companies House and records and all of these kind of things. And she'd also got some familiarity with doing freedom of information requests. And she was able to put all of this to use in basically making what I think is probably the most protracted academy conversion on record, because all of the kind of knowledge she uncovered through undertaking these freedom of information requests, she was able to utilize that knowledge to keep stalling the process. And it lasted, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it might have even been about 18 months, certainly 14 months, I would say. And as she says here, she got a forensic knowledge of how the whole academisation process works, not at school level, at DFE level. And in one of her other, in another part of the interview, she says, look, I know that the DFE, every time I object to something, that they're not following their guidance properly. I've seen through other freedom of information requests that they go back in and change the guidance. So I don't think she's not being, I think she's probably right here, but she's learned that much more that, she's teaching the civil servants involved in the department themselves as well. The second aspect is political learning. So parents themselves were developing political literacy. They were learning about how local government, how councils operate, how the legal system works, how to work with politicians. As Isra points out, really opened up their eyes about working with politics. Several of the participants across PCE and EAC, so the ESPA and the funding campaign, they actually started contacting politicians and were really nervous at the beginning and they just weren't sure about what to do. And then by the end of the project, they're on like first person terms with the politicians. They know who to contact, who to help, who to kind of press to get their agenda promoted. So they'd learn all about how local politics and to some degree national politics work and can potentially serve them as well. Another aspect was learning and practicing democracy. So actually the parents feeling like they are being engaged in some form of direct democracy, if we will, okay? So a form of democracy where we're not just voting every now and again, but they were actually making changes. And through this learning about, you know, how democracy functions at that kind of grassroots level as well. And Floyd is probably the person who, you know, states this most clearly throughout his interviews. But he's like, look, it's really, Floyd, of interest, fled Sierra Leone as a refugee during the Civil War. And so lots of his interview were framed in terms of the democratic deficits in the way local authorities function. And so he's look, we're not just learning about democracy, we're teaching the rest of the community, we're showing what people can do, what power we can have when we put our minds to it, and we've got a reason and a cause to defend. And then the last bit of the political learning is what we might call negative learning. And this is learning that can be disempowering, that can lead to passivity. I framed it as learning that accentuates or reinforces existing barriers to participation, okay? And there was many examples of this, where parents learn that actually this system does not work in their favour. Local authorities don't, you know, they learn not to trust authorities, whether it's based in schools, local authority, the academies, whoever. So there was many examples of negative learning in that, and I think it's captured quite forcefully here. I'll let you read through that. But negative learning isn't necessarily miseducative, okay? Doesn't necessarily lead to it being disempowering or lead to passivity. I think despite numerous examples for parents of where they learn about, you know, the system not being willing to change or corrupt practices, okay, and you can see that here, but Pat Thompson writes about corrupt practices within education. So parents encountered many allegedly corrupt practices. Rather than actually disempowering them and leading to despondency, it actually galvanized parents more. It made them angry. So rather than becoming apathetic, this kind of negative learning made them angry and pushed them on even more. Personal development, okay, so being engaged in activism can lead to identity change. And this was particularly true for the mothers in the study, for several of the mothers in the study, okay. Molly wrote about, for years, I had a child at 19, and for years I've just been mum. I've never had time to think about things for myself. And I've learned new things about myself from doing this. I now know that I am an intelligent woman. I can do X, Y, and Z. I can have conversations with journalists, with politicians, with whoever. And you can get a real sense of that personality change as well there. And you see it in Rose's account here. She was involved in the funding campaign. And she was like, look, you know, you just spend your time being a mum, and that's all right, it's lovely. But, you know, there's nothing there for me. And so now, through campaigning, it's giving myself a bit of me back. And I think really interestingly, she actually says, look, so mothering can be a political identity in its own right. So I think particularly for the mothers involved, we do see elements of this kind of personal transformation and development through engaging in the activism. So the second strand is about sharing knowledge and experience and expertise. I think lots of what I've just been discussing kind of treats the parents as if it's all just an individual learning experience, okay? But, you know, they're working in collective organizations with one another. And so there are collective dimensions to activist pedagogies as well. This comes out in mentoring, okay? So Mina talks here about how they were able to share their experiences, okay, with others. So say, don't do this, don't do X, Y, Z, make sure you do A, B, C, because this will have more import for your campaign. Inspiring others as well. Floyd talks about here how the campaign became much recognised at a local and a national level, and this meant that they could inspire other campaigners as well. Solidarity, again, similar kind of line. ISRA talked about the school, their school in particular, becoming a beacon for other campaigners. And ALIA says, hey, look, we reinsured them. We're able to empower other parents in different campaigns. But interestingly, that works back the other way as well, because through building those networks and through supporting other campaigners, that can help give parents their own sense that they're doing something right, and it can give them the confidence to carry on, particularly in a case like CPC that was so protracted. So the kind of solidarity that they forge with others helps their own campaigns as well. Building social capital and community, sense of community. Lynn talks about this, you know, this activism being a real form of community work. And really interesting, in the case of Eastborough, the Eastborough campaign, one of the other parents, Mark's, in his interview, spoke about how we've transformed the local ward from a passive ward into an active fighting ward. And I think we see that here as well in Floyd's account. Look, you know, and these were in the Eastborough campaign, largely parents from mixed ethnic backgrounds, large South Asian populations at some of the school and some of the communities. And they were able to kind of galvanize the whole community and get them doing not things that were well outside of the comfort zone, but get them doing things. And you got a real sense through some of the Eastborough interviews how this was forging a different kind of identity within the borough. So last bit, the kind of, I suppose this is some of the core hub, which really gets to, you know, what makes parental activism, okay? And this is the idea really that through their activism, and many parents rationalized and framed their involvement in precisely these terms. Through their activism, they were seeking to care for their children as future citizens to be, okay? So they wanted to provide them with a form of political education. I can't say who the quotes are. Jasper, who's you know, quite a well-known scholar in social movement theory and social movement studies, he talks about how becoming involved in activism is often it's often a form of self-presentation. And it's bound up with how you want people, how you see yourself, but also how you want others to see you. And this obviously plays a role in the kind of campaigns that we're talking about, because parents were attaching incredible importance to their idea of embodying values and ideals that they think are important, but also that they wish their children to be able to emulate. So they wanted to be able to model those kind of democratic values and ideals by serving as moral exemplars and role models for the children, okay? And that was seen to be a key part of, you know, the caring for their children through doing this. So all of this kind of rubbish you see, oh, you know, politicians will trout it out at times. Oh, you shouldn't involve children in forms of activism or so on, blah, 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 blah. It's distasteful. It's rubbish. And the parents in our study in particular see this as a way of teaching the children about important values. So it's not just that parents wanted to be good role models either. It's not that they just wanted to be good exemplars. They wanted to be seen to be by their children. They wanted their children to see that their parents are standing up for what they believe in, as you can see in Carol's comments here. So it's partly bound up with who the parents are and how they see themselves, but it's also about demonstrating that to their children and young people. So engaging in activism then is a way for parents to demonstrate that they care for their children, to demonstrate that they are good parents, you know, in the way that they conceive of themselves and their responsibilities and duties as a parent. And again, Molly kind of really captures this. Just a bit of context, Molly, during the initial months of her campaign, was in sheltered housing in one room with 2 children, both of whom were, you know, at the latter end of primary school age, no money, health problems. She wrote how they were doing all of these compliancy kind of checks while all the clothes are in a bin bag on the floor, drinking gin in this horrible house, like flat thing she was living in. And she put incredible amount of time into doing the campaign. It took up her entire life. Okay, she was always dragging them to meetings, always doing this and that. And as she writes about elsewhere, to the detriment, to some ways, of her children and family circumstances. But she did it because she believed this was right. And as she's saying here, she hopes that her children, when they grow up, are able to see that, you know, my mum, she stood up for what she believed in. She really did as much as she could to protect our education and all of those kind of things. And as she mentions at the end, you know, there's not much you can give her children apart from this set of values and this set of morals. Some parents encourage their children to actually become involved in the campaigns as well. So Mark, for example, he wrote, he said that it's, you know, an important part of their political education. He wanted to involve them and show them what they were doing. And as he says here, it's a kind of a protective measure as well. If we can teach our children to be able to stand up for what they believe in, then it can be a kind of empowering thing. The PCE campaign, as you can see from the pictures, that was very child-fronted. You know, all of their campaign materials involved children, were very colourful, got picked up in the media quite readily because of these kind of things. And as several of the parents themselves would attest, this was, you know, a strategic decision, you know, to pull on the emotional heartstrings of the media and politicians and so on. But at the same time, it was about being able to show their children as well that they too can have political agency. They too can be political actors. Okay, so yes, it had the strategic element in terms of achieving campaign goals and all of those kind of things, but it was also equally framed as a way of educating children and getting them involved. This is my semi-gratuitous picture of my own daughter here, and I did get permission to show her face. This is when we went to an Eastborough lobby on a very cold, very wet winter's evening, I think. I think the important point here is this idea of teaching their children about politics, trying to impart a set of morals and values onto their children. It's not an incidental or accidental feature of their activism, okay? It's bound up with how parents see what it is that they are doing. It's integral to it. I don't think it's just happenstance. It is a central part of what they're doing. And as I said, the parents rationalized it in that kind of way as well. So I would argue that this pedagogical dimension has a very particular kind of significance for when it comes to parental activism. It's one of the ways that they demonstrate that parental care and responsibility that I said earlier is effectively defines or constitutes what is the specificity of parental activism. So I think this pedagogical element is right there as a central feature of parental activism. And interestingly, I've conducted, since this original tranche of data, I've conducted at least another 20 interviews with parents involved in different kind of campaigns. And these things that I've just been talking about now, they come up within that data as well. So it's quite encouraging to see that, that this seems to be quite a common think across a wider data set. I realise I'm a little bit over time, but just to conclude then, so we've looked at what and how parents learn through engaging in activism, how they share knowledge and experience and expertise across wider struggles, and how they sought to use their activism as a vehicle for providing their children with a democratic education. And I think that the parental activism is peculiar for having this kind of intentional pedagogical dimension. And maybe, irrespective of whether the campaigns achieve the goals and all of that kind of thing, maybe it's in this intergenerational transmission of particular democratic sensibilities and dispositions and particular values that maybe that's where the value of this kind of stuff lies. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nathan. Wow. Well, we have a really lively chat, and I'm sure there's going to be lots of people that want to either share what they've reflected on in the chat or to ask some questions, but really provocative when we look at parental activism, to think about, is it becoming more visible, and who to, and what does it depend on? So really provocative, thinking about the characteristics and traits of parental activism, and you know, the interests of the child, but the interest of the parent and the family. So so many layers and levels of interests there as well. And I really like the picture of the child with the banner. I think that was your child, but again, the child's voice, because the parents are expressing on behalf of, you know, their child, their family. So really provocative. And you know, you also, from the chat, there's lots of discussion talking about taking the leap to be active. And it's interesting who is being active and who isn't, and why not. That they're really provocative points that kind of leaked out from your research. And again, it's the parents learning, but it's also the children learning, as you say, the schools learning, society learning, us, you know, academics learning, the researchers learning so much from what you've shared with us. So, and really love the point on the new skills, taking that leap into being active and voicing out, and there were some really interesting points on the chat that I don't know if anybody, if we stop sharing maybe for a moment, we can see some hands up, and who wants to come in there. Right, because I know if we look at the chat, I think Andrew, did you want to share anything? Andrew had some points about future research and ideas. Is that okay to come in there, Andrew?
Sure, and I'll be quick. I know, guys, we don't have much time. Thank you, Nathan, for a fantastic presentation. I'm always keen to hear about, you know, what you're writing about, and I think it's really important work. And actually, listening to you made me think a lot about the literature around informal learning and public pedagogy. And I don't think you refer to it explicitly, but it connects really powerfully for a lot of your work. One of the things I was thinking about is how would you go about getting big funding for something like this, which is not something we should always be striving for, but I think it's such important work, and thinking about how you would do it, because I suspect this is important, albeit very politically contentious. And that can be a good thing, but almost could be a bad thing from a funder's perspective. And I was thinking, wouldn't it be great if someone like yourself or a team went to these schools that successfully resisted academization, and you showed how they did it? And I know a lot of schools who had to, you know, how they did this legally and strategically, often with the communities and parents. Some are successful at, some aren't, but we don't know on what grounds and what contingencies these things happen, and we'd love to know more. And I suspect that for lots of people, the funders in particular, the danger here would be, and from the DFE's perspective, you might go and share these results with other schools who are similarly looking to resist it. I've wondered if you've considered whether that might be another viable research agenda for yourself, given what you've talked about.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. Thinking about, so you'd maybe shift away from thinking about current campaigns and activists involved in current campaigns to actually seeing what happens in those schools where they successfully kind of campaign to protect the local authority status of them. Is that right?
I suspect the successful co-option of that activism too, because I suspect it looks at activism because it's separate from what the schools want to do. But I think a lot of schools that have successfully resisted academisation have found ways to incorporate everything that you've been talking about. So it doesn't sit outside the school's political action, but it's inherent to the work of the school and what they're trying to do together, right? It's the fact that this somehow sits outside, which I find interesting, and why it sits there.
Yeah, and at varying levels within the anti-academisation campaigns, and there's currently a few live ones that have been working as well, but different levels of support within the schools themselves. So the Crowley Parents Campaign, the whole school community were involved. Whereas at Eastborough, lots of the head teachers and senior leadership had their fingers in the pies and were quite forceful in pushing it through. So you have different levels. I suppose you have fractious relationships with different levels of authority depending on the nature of the campaign itself. There was a successful campaign in Sheffield last year, and they were in dialogue with other campaigners. And so one of the ways maybe is, yeah, it's about information sharing. Yeah, maybe there is possibilities there. I think one of the reasons I carried on collecting the data was very pessimistic views about ever getting any funding to actually do a wider study of it. So I thought, well, while I've got the bit between the teeth, I'll just keep going, seeing as I'm, well versed in doing unfunded research.
Well, thanks for the great work and the stimulating presentation, Nathan.
Cheers, Andrew.
Thank you. Again, Nathan, the levels, the voices, the punishing and the trust was really oozing out of the points that you raised with us. And I don't know if Nazish is free to comment at this point, because some comments were raised about parent activism in schools and how some schools are more, promotive than others. Nazish, are you free to come in now? I'm putting you on the spot a bit.
Hi, I'm here. Sorry, just got a few other things going on in the background. Quick one. I've always I've been a big fan of including the parents, as you were saying earlier. We can't achieve an education all by ourselves. So there's always a 360-degree view kind of thing where the children are there, parents are there, teachers are there, and then we have got all of the external factors, as rightly so Andrew was talking about, a bit of political side coming in and shaping the education as well. I believe I'm a strong advocate of having parents, as I suggested in the chat as well. The parents won't be positive all the time, and rightly so. There's several things going on. I'm a parent myself. There will be things that they won't be happy about. Either it's driven politically or within our own organizations. I do feel historically, the more we have been guarded as leaders in education, there were quite a lot of problems. Then the leadership in education is evolving as well. And in recent time, the more we have been open and honest about either it's a change, either it's a transformation, or anything that's going on within UK or within this world, I think the more we have made them a part of that process. As I said, I won't call it activism as in a negative thing, or they're here to complain, or they're the ones who are changing the society or the direction that we are heading to. I think it has bring in a positive change, at least in my school and in our organization. I admit previously I've been very guarded, as in, oh, here we go. It's a parent as well. Oh my goodness me, there's 6 and 7 of them. They've joined forces. Something bad's going to happen. To then, these are the parents that where we have provided them with the platform. They are the ones who are bringing in a positive change in the school. They are the ones who are taking the directions with us, from us, and then involving all the other parents and the wider community. So it's amazing. I'm a great fan of that. And I think your work is amazing, brilliant.
Thanks, Nazish. And I think some of what you said there helps provide a bit of an answer to Andrew, maybe as well, because in the chapter I published last year and in the BERA blog, I mentioned about the need for thinking thinking about more effective modes of participation, more effective forums for parents to be able to contribute to key kind of policy decisions around schools. I don't mean at the level of national policy, but being involved in processes more. So the school can be a space for genuine democratic involvement of the parents as well. I'm not suggesting that needs to be around every single matter, obviously, but the current system, and I know Andrew's written about governing bodies in schools quite a bit, but one of the things that the parents in the anti-academisation campaigns, they were like, there is just no medium for us to be able to have sensible, meaningful conversations about these kind of things. And there's no truthful information being passed on. In fact, several of the parents originally at the start were parent governors, and they basically got ejected in one way or the other. But yeah, so creating more horizontal democratic forms of participation for parents within schools. And maybe, Andrew, some of the positive, successful campaigns have started to integrate something a bit more into schools. So as an example, one of the schools in Eastborough, they had the consultation process, but it was all monolingual, despite this being a very, very diverse school. And the parents had to fight for translators, and then they knew the translators were not translating properly. They had to do a leaflet in 7 different languages, I think it was, to share with families so that they had a sense for it. So yeah, working towards, I suppose, better forums for parents, I think.
And Nathan, another example of the VAT decision coming from the Labour Party for the independent school sector and how they're delivering it. They have involved parents big time to deliver that to the schools. 70% of the population which they carried out their bit of research or the case study are all the parents who are actually part of these independent school. So like there is a big hoo-ha, but at the end we all know that it's going to be a part of our policies, our procedures, and it's going forward.
Yeah.
Okay, right to the button. I'm going to thank you for stimulating presentation, Nathan. Again, very provocative, very real, capturing the lived realities of those who are living, with school, in school, or got any stakeholderage within school life, and how we can get together to make voices heard. We can make changes, but what are the challenges really provoked out today? So I'm going to say thank you so much for sharing your research and your provocations, and to everybody for coming and joining us and with Nathan today, and for your dialogues. You've got a very lively chat, Nathan, so I've just saved it for you because I think it will be interesting to go back on. And please do email Nathan if anybody's got any further questions. And Sarah's gone, but she had the nursery activism, the parental activism point in the chat to say how powerful it is, because the nursery is still at Middlesex because of the activism. So really a nice way to finish on a high.
Yeah, and I've spoken with parents around children's centre closures and school closures, because that's another thing that's coming, particularly in London. Schools are starting to close because the demographics are changing. And funnily enough, the parents I spoke to on the school closure campaign, loads of similar things to the anti-academisation campaigns. It's all, you can just see the common themes just running through. Doesn't matter on the type of campaign, there's just, lots of common themes that emerge. So
watch this space, Nathan. There's more to come. I think there's tentacles everywhere on that. So thank you everybody for today, and we look forward to seeing you on the 10th of June with Middlesex University education team, where they're going to be sharing their interdisciplinary eco-pedagogies for primary education interests and research. So we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you all.
Cheers. Thank you.